end of the Congress recap, 5 days of soulful deliberations at the Seoul Congress, 1 day opening ceremony, 4 days of grueling technical sessions, capped off by what was a riveting panel discussion yesterday on the future of the arm's length principle, the future of the international tax system, where Pascal Saint-Amans opened a new debate, literally laid out the turf for what he called would be a big debate in the coming years on the allocation of taxing rights and the new nexus rules. And to discuss, some of these interesting panel discussions that happened at the Seoul Congress over the last 4 days, we have on my right, Stef van Weeghel, former chair of the Permanent Scientific Committee of IFA, the global tax policy leader at PwC Global, also the professor at the University of Amsterdam, and the academic chair of IBFD.
Chair of the board.
Chair of the board of IBFD. Stef, thanks so much for joining us. And to my left, a person who needs no introduction to the Indian viewers at all, senior advocate, former IFA president Porus Kaka. And if you wonder why he's looking so relaxed as compared to the last 4 or 5 years, that's because he's done with his term, with a very successful term, which was capped off by the brilliant Rio Congress. Oh, we really miss Rio and the beaches, Porus. But Stef, let's start with you. The highlight of the Congress was clearly your session, the IFA OECD one yesterday, where we deliberated on the future of the international tax system. The big takeaways or the big buzzwords, the catchphrases. You had Pascal Saint-Amans clearly acknowledging that the arm's length standard, is definitely under pressure from the US after the tax reforms. You had Akhilesh Ranjan, the senior Indian IRS officer, Mr. Ranjan, saying that the ALP is under tremendous strain. You yourself, posed a couple of questions, fundamental questions about whether we are going to pay mere lip service to the ALP and whether formulary apportionment is going to be the way going forward. These are big ponderables for the next 2 to 3 years, Stef.
Yeah. Well, I did not use without reason the word crisis. I think truly that the international tax world is in crisis. It's clear that everything we constructed in the past decades, the nexus principles, the arm's length principle, they are all starting from the point of a physical presence and people performing significant work in the places where the physical presence is. And that's no longer our world. So we see the disintermediation, we see the mass of the internet players, the big digital companies. So that is a big theme. There is also, regardless from what policymakers and revenue ministries think and what the actual revenue from current activities currently is, there is enormous political pressure and pressure from I would say the population at large, because the notion is that foreign companies are able to generate enormous profit. In fact, what they generate, of course, in reality is enormous revenue, but that's equated with profit. And clearly the countries where the markets are and where the profit is generated wish to have part of the tax revenue arising from that. So the upshot, and why I was a bit provocative in the direction of Pascal Saint-Amans yesterday, was, how fit is the arm's length principle to address all that? At the end of the day, it's all about, we have this one big tax pie, how are we going to divide it amongst the different countries? And clearly the markets and the users where they sit, those countries will want to have a part of that pie. So if you start, and I think in his response, Pascal Saint-Amans acknowledged that and said that if you start with the pie and with the countries and how you think you can divide the pie, then start to think about the principles and the construct that would help you to achieve that result.
That's reversing the order almost.
Sorry?
That's reversing the order,
yes,
actually.
Yes, which makes all the sense in the world. But it also necessitates a fresh review of everything we have. You have to be willing, and that's why I use the words lip service, you have to be willing to ask fundamental questions.
To give a go-by to the conventional principles, or what were conventional principles for decades?
Maybe we end up with formulary apportionment, or maybe we...
What are the chances?
It's a challenge. I think it's
What
a
are the
challenge.
chances that we end up with formulary apportionment? If you had to give a number.
I would say if we give it enough time and do not really attach too much value to the label that we give it in due course, I would say more than 50%.
More than 50%?
Yes.
And very soon?
No, not very soon.
Give it time.
This will be a protracted and long process.
For us, must be a fascinating debate, even wearing your legal hat and not just the academic hat. Porus, that while so much of time we've spent on previous congresses on dispute resolution, MLI, BEPS and the action plans. This time it was about the future of the international tax system once again after 5 years, and the trigger this time seems to be the digital economy conversation.
Absolutely, because if you will see the digital economy, or what they call the digital presence, it's all different words. But if you just saw the slide this morning in the recent development, more than 25 countries, I think, are now into unilateral measures.
That's
so I think where Stef mentioned the crisis, I've always cautioned that BEPS was supposed to solve double non-taxation. But clearly with the unilateral measures, we are going to end up in double taxation. It has to be. When you work out a gross-based taxation system or a tax system which is outside tax treaties, you're going to get that problem. And the digital tax solutions that are there or are even being proposed, and I'm not against them. I do believe that the PE definition requires certain rethinking on the business model. But these are models that are clearly, or the solutions which are totally not in line with even current basic principles of attribution of profit and transfer pricing.
For example,
today, the definition that India has of significant economic presence, which is statutory, for the first time will tax business which is being done with India without there necessarily being any operations in India, which is the basic principle of 9.1. 9.1 restricts India's taxing rights to operations within India. Significant economic presence changes that. So how will you first attribute the profits, and secondly, how will you transfer price? In transfer pricing, the solutions which are currently on the table or even under discussion, they are not in the commentary. For example, DMP. DMP doesn't fit into data. It doesn't fit into users. It has other human characteristics. All this will have to be changed to accommodate the new way forward.
Mr. Akhilesh Ranjan, in fact, advocated the use of the significant economic principle, presence principle, legislated by India. He said that could be the way forward. That could be the basis of a broader nexus principle.
In my opinion, personally, I think there requires a change. I do not dispute that. But I do not necessarily completely agree with unilateral steps. I think we
Is that the move forward? Is that the way in which directionally we need to
I
move
hope
forward?
not. Because the unilateral steps will not result in significant revenue, because the tax treaties are not going to be changed. And I think ultimately all corporations must be taxed on a net income basis. That's my principle. I don't think it is fair to tax them on a gross basis. And if you have unilateral taxes outside tax treaties, you're going to get into a system of double taxation. So I have reservations. India's significant economic presence definition requires two important aspects alongside of work,
Which is?
Attribution and transfer pricing. That has not been done.
Stef, who's going to drive the debate in the next 2 to 3 years? While Mr. Aman's laid the groundwork, he laid down the turf, he defined the turf for the debate. Who's going to drive it? Is it going to be Europe, the European Commission? Is it going to be the OECD? Right now we are not even counting UN anywhere for the time being. Or is it going to be the big elephant in the room, the big 800-pound elephant in the room, which is the United States?
I think we have a few superpowers in this discussion. Your country, India, is one of them. The US is another. I think Germany is very important in this discussion. Hopefully the EU will be able to get its act together.
And reconcile with the OECD.
And no, I'm not saying reconcile with the OECD, but be part of the larger debate. I think as of today we will know whether the DST will go anywhere. Tomorrow there is an ECOFIN meeting when this seems to be on the agenda. I'm not in favor, I should say, of the DST or other unilateral measures for that matter. I think the wisest would be that this is all channeled through the OECD, and they are mandated, their task is to find consensus. But the important players, or three very important players here, are India, the US, Germany, and I would hope also the EU, because I should say that the longer-term plan of the EU with the CCCTB and a significant digital presence as part of that, I like that conceptually very much, because effectively it is formulary apportionment, and then you can talk about the different factors that you take into account. But to me,
is that the future? CCCTB?
Well, you call it CCCTB or you call it formulary apportionment, but some formula in which the total tax pie is divided over the countries that have relevant factors, that is the future. And the question is, how do you get there? And I agree completely with Porus. There are very, very few things we disagree on. That the real concern is here double taxation. So we have to have consensus so that whatever is taxed is either not taxed elsewhere, or it's exempt, or is a credit. So we have to come to a coherent system. That's our duty.
Yeah. On the transfer pricing landscape as well, the panel felt that transfer pricing has become, in the words of a panelist, very complex, subjective, and actually was concerned, afraid, in fact, anxious that non-transfer pricing policymakers may not even be able to understand what is being discussed.
I can be very short on that. Fair point.
For us, TP is become, what I remember one former commissioner used to say about international tax. It's become a preserve of the few.
Well, international tax was a preserve of the few. TP is probably a small sect of that, but I think the mushrooming of transfer pricing litigation, it now takes up a significant portion of my time in courts, and we are no longer arguing on PE necessarily, and I have probably a week at a time where I'll be only doing specifically transfer pricing, which even for a lawyer sometimes is difficult because we have to get into economics, which is not necessarily our strong point.
How difficult would it be for judges who do not do it for a living, who do not read up transfer pricing every day?
So two answers to that. Very difficult for tribunal members because they have to look at factual matters. So they have to look at actually probably the economics of the transaction, so perhaps slightly higher. To the High Court and Supreme Court, where they are more concerned with legal principles, I think I've always maintained that if you have a good judge who hears both sides, you do not necessarily need an expert person.
Amma, you want to ask any question? You want to pose any question? Then we'll wind it up.
Stef, the discussion on the digital economy is moving in all directions with unilateral measures. Finally, how do you think the discussion on the digital economy will move forward, and will there be ever a consensus on this point?
That's a good question. In fact, it is a variation on the broader question that we just addressed, of course. So we know the time frame for the OECD to get to a final report. I think there will be a lot of political pressure to come to consensus, but there is also sort of diverging motions. So we have this pressure to come to consensus, which would be a multilateral approach. At the same time, as we have learned also in the past few days, countries tend to go more and more their own way unilaterally in the past few years. So hopefully the world, the policymakers in the tax world, the politicians will come to their senses and be willing to give up some of their sovereignty, perhaps in some cases to be willing to give up some of their revenue in order to come to this consensus-based system, whatever it will be at the end of the day. And when I say giving up some revenue, if one puts that in perspective, in the OECD world, the corporate income tax, we're all talking about corporate income tax here, is only between 8 and 10% of the total revenue. So let's say that you come to consensus and maybe over time you lose 10% of your corporate tax revenue. That may look like a big number, but as a percentage of your total tax revenue, that is very small.
Sure.
Combine that with the trend that more revenue is collected with indirect taxes, and that trend will increase, and that probably the percentage of corporate income tax of total revenue will decrease anyway. I would say that that helps to achieve consensus if you put it in perspective in this way.
Very interesting, but I guess it will not be easy to make it happen, I guess.
No, it will be very difficult because
Right.
what I see, the Netherlands is a small country, not very relevant internationally, but the discussion in our country is very much, if we can do something that effectively taxes the foreigner, we'll be happy with it. And also in the context of the discussion about the CCCTB, the fact that the Netherlands would lose revenue has been a big factor in deciding so far negatively on supporting the CCCTB. So I'm not suggesting it's easy, but my request would be to everyone involved, put it in the bigger perspective.
Sure. Porus, anti-avoidance was one of the first plenary topics here at the Congress, looking at the global trends. Back home in India, we have a general anti-avoidance rules, GAR, which are already effective. We also will have PPT test come into the treaties that India has signed as well. How do you think the litigation around the GAR will pan out in India, and your take on the global perspective as well?
Well, if you see globally, I think the experience of the countries that have had GAR, it's more been of a deterrent rather than an enforcement measure. Canada or many of the countries, they've really not invoked it as frequently as one would expect, and it's been an extremely limited kind of a situation. I have no idea what India is going to do with it, and I think that's really for the revenue to answer, because today when I see the litigation, in innocuous cases the argument is, this is for tax avoidance, or so. It's a very loosely put term. So I think it'll be for the revenue to decide whether they're going to significantly target, say, 30 or 40% of the transactions, or they're going to do what is done internationally, which is you target a few limited transactions which you really feel fall within the basket. I think experience shows if they go bludgeonly and go to many, I think the courts will lean probably again in favor of the taxpayer, because when you have this kind of thing where transactions are not covered or not necessarily to fall, perhaps you have that. If they go limited, perhaps they may have a better experience. But I'm certainly nervous as to, you've seen how transfer pricing changed India's litigation landscape, and
Sure.
I hope that's not the same thing for GAR and PBT.
Right. Judicial GAR has been there in India even when we did not have a formal codified law. Do you think there will be a substantial change in the approach of the judiciary going forward with the formal codified GAR?
Jeff, you remember the panel on Monday? That was fascinating, because I think the comments of Philippe or any of them on the panel was fascinating, that when you have a statutory GAR, then I think it makes it life, and I'm just quoting, it makes actually life easier for judges, because you have to apply it within those principles rather than getting into your own notions of what is a judicial GAR. Again, India to a certain extent has had a very limited judicial GAR, because whichever judgment you look at, starting from, except for McDowell to a certain extent, but Azadi and thereafter Vodafone, etc., we do respect form.
Sure.
As long as it's not completely artificial. If there are reasons for the form, India does respect it. Let's see what happens going forward.
Thank you so much, Porus and Stef. Arun will do the comments.
Cannot let you all go without asking you about wearing your hat, Nostradamus hat, and predicting what will happen in the next 2 years. While Pascal has outlined the turf for the new debate, what are the topics you think which will be hot at when we meet again at the London Congress next year?
Gee, that's a tough question. to an extent, not much will happen the next 2 years, which may sound very strange, but I think we will mostly have discussion the next 2 years. We'll see unilateral measures popping up everywhere, but about the long-term direction, it will be lots of discussion. What will happen is that the MLI will be effective for many countries only starting in January 2020. And that will be a major thing because then Porus was talking with you about GARS and PPT. The PPT will become a real instrument in the hands of revenue authorities. There is currently a lot of anxiety about the principal purposes test, how it will be applied. And I think once we get closer to January 2020, that anxiety will increase, and that's where quite a bit of action will be, I would suspect.
Perfect. Porus, your crystal ball gazing.
So I think when I look at BEPS, and as Stef mentioned, the MLI comes into force and PPT comes into force, what I see changing is not only disputes between corporates and governments, but also government to government as to what is the jurisdiction that I have the right to tax. And that's going to be a huge challenge, because if you do not have mechanisms to settle that, and we don't have that because we don't have arbitration in global treaties or even a form of mediation, I think that's going to be a huge challenge for the competent authorities to settle. Because when you look at BEPS and the subjectivity it brings into, just for example, the PE clause and the habitual conclusion or leading up to the habitual conclusion, you could have two people coming to different views. So you're going to have disputes now, not only government to corporate, but government to government.
Pascal proposed the ICAP, a new multilateral forum. He also, said that let's focus on things that are working, then on then on instruments that are not. For example, mediation or arbitration. He felt, let's use our resources. I'm quoting him. Let's use our resources on MAP.
Yeah. So I think, look, for the OECD, for the revenue authorities, MAP is their preferred solution because that's where they are.
And he
involved.
said we should make it work.
That's their. I'm quite optimistic on Action 14. I've always been. I think the peer reviews, etc., and also countries like India, China agreeing to open up their transparency on that is definitely going to be a significant pressure to ensure that system works. But being a lawyer, I always like a court of law or a process which is outside necessarily revenue authorities as an option also.
So will courts step in on BEPS in some way or the other and give their take or their opinion maybe starting 2021 or 2020?
Bound to, because they will be interpreting the PPT.
Thanks, Stef. Thanks, Porus. Thank
Welcome.
you so much. That's all we have from the Seoul Congress as we wind up our coverage here from IFA. Again, a very, very, very successful Congress, Porus.
I'm delighted.
Stef?
I'm thrilled. Yes.
Thank you.